cross-site scripting. If you ever see this abbreviated, it's abbreviated with an XSS instead of a CSS that you might think with cross-site scripting, but CSS is commonly associated with cascading style sheets. And when you're working in web publishing, that's a very popular topic, so keep in mind that a cross-site script is an XSS. We call this cross-site scripting because this was originally associated with a browser vulnerability that allowed information from one site to be shared with another site. These days, it's common to simply have this information shared from someone else's browser and sent to the attacker. This is also an extremely common vulnerability to find on web-based applications. So it's very important that if you're developing a web-based application, that you look for and prevent these types of scripting vulnerabilities in the input of your application. We use JavaScript for so much in our browsers to be able to automate and add additional functionality, but the attackers know that they can also use JavaScript in conjunction with a vulnerable website to be able to gather information from your computer without you even knowing it happened. One type of cross-site scripting vulnerability is the non-persistent, or what we sometimes refer to as a reflected cross-site scripting attack. This is found on a website that would allow someone to run scripts within the user input fields on that device. This might be in a search field or some other input field on the web page. To be able to take advantage of this attack, the attacker needs the victim to click a very specific kind of link. Very often this is sent to the victim through an email, and the attacker will encourage the victim to click that email link to start the reflected cross-site scripting attack. The victim often clicks that link to run malicious scripts that are embedded within that URL, and whatever the output or payload from that particular result is usually sent to the attacker. This can often be session IDs or user credentials or anything else the attacker would like to gather from that victim's machine. Here's a web application with a vulnerable field that would allow a cross-site scripting attack. This is a purpose-built application that has this flaw in it, and this is from something called WebGoat. If you wanted to run this WebGoat utility on your computer, you could load this up and perform your own cross-site scripting attacks. This is a shopping cart. In the shopping cart, you can modify the quantities, you can put in credit card numbers and access codes. We're going to put a little bit of JavaScript right at the end of the credit card number. Let me back up a bit so we can really see what's happening. At the end of the credit card number, it has a quote and then starts a JavaScript, which in this particular case puts an alert on the screen. Usually the attacker doesn't send an alert to the screen, they simply send that information off to the attacker's computer instead of showing anything on the victim's workstation. But for this example, we're going to put this script alert on the screen, and it's going to show your session information, and then it's going to show cookie and session ID information for this particular user. If that information was to get into the hands of the attacker would be able to log in and gain access to this information without needing a username and password. They would simply use the stolen session ID information. Once we click the purchase button, we get a message at the top of our screen that is the session information, the JSession ID, and the PHP session ID, all in that alert message. This would normally be sent to the attacker, and they would be able to authenticate to this website as if they were us, and of course they would then gain access to all of our personal information. For the reflected cross-site scripting attack, we have to have that user click a very specifically crafted link for that particular vulnerability to be exploited. There's another type of cross-site scripting attack that can be stored permanently on a server, and anyone visiting that page would be running the script. This is a persistent or stored cross-site scripting attack. You'll often see this kind of attack on websites that have messages or forum posts, and the cross-site scripting attack is embedded within that post. Once the attacker posts their malicious message, everyone who reads through that particular post will also get that malicious script and run it on their local machine. With the reflective attack, the attacker could specify the user that they were targeting. But with something like a stored cross-site scripting attack, that particular script is on the page, and anyone visiting the page would be running this script. As you can imagine, if anyone visiting the page is a victim of this particular attack, it can spread very quickly over social media. Someone liking a page or sharing a page might bring other folks to the page, and their machines would also run this particular malicious script. A practical example of a cross-site scripting attack was found by Aaron Guzman in June 2017. He's a security researcher that found when he logged into the Subaru website, his particular session was given a token. His login token and session ID allowed him to connect back to the site without having to log in with his username and password. But what he found was that the token never expired. So anytime his computer accessed the Subaru website, he was automatically authenticated and would not have to re-input his username and password. Well, this also meant that if anyone else gained access to this authentication token, they would also be able to gain access to his account details. This authentication token provided access to service requests on the Subaru website. For example, if you wanted to add a different user's email to your particular vehicle, you could simply add that within your account information. This also meant that an attacker could add their email address to your car and have full access to the online capabilities available for your Subaru. Compounding this problem was that the Subaru website had a cross-site scripting vulnerability in one of these input fields. And this means that anyone logging into the system could have their token sent to an attacker who would then be able to add their email and gain full access to your car. This is yet another reason why we always tell you to never click a link in your email. It's very difficult to see what that link consists of, and even if you could see it, it's very easy to hide malicious information within that link. It's better instead to go to the website that's referenced in the email and log in yourself manually. Another option might be to disable JavaScript entirely, but that's very difficult to do on today's modern websites. It's probably more practical to have an extension or security tool that would allow you to manage the use of JavaScript on your system. Many of these vulnerabilities are also part of the browser, so keeping your browser up to date is also a good way to maintain the security of your system. And if you're a developer, make sure that you're validating all of the fields on a website. That way no one can take advantage and exploit something that might be a cross-site scripting vulnerability on your site. A code injection attack is when the attacker puts their own code into an existing data stream. This is often enabled because of bad programming with an application. An application shouldn't allow you to put your own code into a data stream. Often the code is not checked by the application, and attackers are able to exploit that vulnerability. There's many different types of code that you can inject. You can inject HTML or LDAP or SQL code, and any one of those may be able to manipulate or gather information from a machine, especially if you have control over the type of code that you would put into that data stream. One very common code injection type is a SQL injection. SQL stands for Structured Query Language, or SQL. This is a very common relational database used on many websites. If you can circumvent the web front end, then you can gain access to the data that's in that database. Of course, the web front end should not allow these types of requests, but if the input is not validated, it's very easy to be able to get around the application and be able to run whatever queries you would like on that database directly. Let's run a database injection on this intentionally vulnerable application that is found in WebGoat. You can load WebGoat on your own machine and run through your own SQL injection lesson. This particular lesson has a form, and it's used by an employee to gain access to their own personal information. The employee name is John Smith, and this particular application has a transaction authorization number that's used. The number in this one is 3SL99A. The way that it would work is the employee would put their last name into the box and then put the authorization number 3SL99A, and when they click Get Department, they would gather information specific to them. But this particular web front end does not validate anything typed into the authentication number field. So we can modify this just a bit by adding an OR 1 = 1 to the end of this, which is SQL code that basically says find everything with the authentication number 3SL99A or anything where 1 = 1. And of course, 1 does equal 1, which means anything that would be true. That means we can dump the entire database contents to our screen by simply adding on just a little bit of text on the end. And if we click that button, we can now view the names, departments, and salaries for everybody in the company. There are other types of injection attacks you might see. Another one might be with XML. XML is the extensible markup language. It's very commonly used to transfer data between two different kinds of devices, and you can perform an XML injection by sending this malformed XML off to a separate device. Obviously, a well-written application will validate that XML as it's being put into the system. Another type of valuable data injection might be to an LDAP server. LDAP is a lightweight directory access protocol. LDAP is commonly used to store information about authentication, such as username and password, or other information about devices or users. If you're able to inject data and gather details from that LDAP database, you may be able to gather a lot of information that you normally would not have access to. Another type of injection is a DLL injection. This is a dynamic link library, and a DLL injection is a way to inject some code into an application to have that application execute the code for us. In this DLL injection example, we have two processes, a process B, that is the attacker, and a process A, that is the victim. Process B is going to attach to that first process, allocate some memory for this DLL library, and then copy the DLL into process A. At that point, process A will execute that DLL as a new thread, running it as process A, which may give it additional rights and additional capabilities that process B would not normally have. A buffer overflow attack occurs when one section of memory is able to overwrite a different section of memory. This type of overwriting or spilling over of memory should not occur, and if someone is able to replicate that in a way that's controllable, they may be able to gain access to the system or cause an application to perform the way that they would like. This is a type of vulnerability that takes advantage of poor programming, and application developers need to make sure that they perform bounds checking to make sure that no one is able to overwrite different sections of memory. This is not a simple exploit to find, and it's not an easy exploit for an attacker to take advantage of. It's very difficult to find some software that would allow this buffer overflow, and then it's very difficult to have a buffer overflow that might not cause the system to become unstable or to crash. A good buffer overflow for an attacker is one that they can both replicate and one that they can control. Here's a visual example of what a buffer overflow might look like. In this particular computer, we have an application that's running with two variables, a variable A and a variable B. Right now, the only variable that has data inside of it is variable B, which has the value 1979. We looked at that in hexadecimal, it would be the value 07 Bravo Bravo. You can see that nothing has been set for variable A. If this application was vulnerable to a buffer overflow, we might be able to overwrite the value of variable A and have it spill over into the area that's currently used by variable B. Here's the aftermath of a buffer overflow where we've taken the word excessive and put it into variable A. You'll notice that variable A has enough room for the EXCESSIV, and then the E at the end doesn't fit into that specific area set up for that variable, so it overflows into the next variable in memory and has that 65, which is the E, stuck onto variable B. And notice that it has changed the value of variable B. It may be that changing that value of variable B allows the attacker to gain elevated rights or a section of the operating system that they would not normally have. Or maybe it allows the attacker to be able to crash the system whenever they like, creating a denial of service by using this buffer overflow attack. The communication that we send from our computer to other devices on the network will very often have information that a crafty hacker can use against us. This might be a session ID, it might be login credentials, but they want to be able to find the information in those network flows and be able to use it as an advantage during an attack. This means the attacker needs to find a way to gather that network information. If they have physical access to the network, they can physically install a network tap that will redirect or send a copy of all network traffic to their workstation. If they don't have physical access to the network, then they need to find some logical way to redirect that information, and one way they might do that is through something like ARP poisoning. Or they might just simply add their own code or malware onto your computer, and they'll use your computer to gather that information and then send it back to the attacker. If the attacker can capture information that can then be replayed across the network to make it seem as if it was coming from you, this is called a replay attack. And they want to be able to gather session IDs or credentials and be able to use those credentials later on across the network. Although the initial gathering of the information may involve the attacker being on the path between the two devices, that's not a requirement for the actual replay attack. The replay attack can be done afterwards. The original user does not even need to be on the network at that time. One very simple kind of replay attack is called pass the hash. This is referring to the hash value that is associated with a password that is sent across the network during the authentication process. If the attacker can gain access to the hash, they may be able to replay that hash back to the server and pretend that they are the original workstation. In our network here, we have three devices. We have the client device that will be the victim, we have an attacker that's on the network, and we have the server that is communicating back and forth with the client. During the initial authentication process where the client sends username and password information to the server, what's usually sent across the network is the username and a password hash. As that information is being sent to the server, the attacker puts something in the middle of the network, this might be a redirection of the network or an ARP poisoning of some kind, and redirects that hash down to their device as well. That means that they're going to have a copy of that hash on their computer. Now that the attacker has that hash, they can pretend to be the original user by sending the username and hash information off to the server as if they were doing this from the original client's workstation. From the perspective of the server, this looks like a normal authentication coming from a legitimate user, and that means that the attacker would then have access to that user's account on that server. One way that developers can avoid this type of pass-the-hash attack is to make sure that the client and the server are always communicating over an encrypted channel, such as SSL or TLS. If that channel is sending encrypted data, it doesn't matter what the attacker gathers, they won't be able to find any of the hash or anything else inside of that encrypted information. Another technique developers use is to salt the hash. They might salt it with the session ID, and when that session ID is sent across to the server to authenticate, it's a one-time authentication process. Even if somebody was to gather that information across the network as it was being sent originally, they would not be able to reuse it, and the replay attack of this kind would not be successful. This is also why we want to be sure that the cookies saved in our browser configuration on our computers are secure. The browser cookies that are on your computer may contain information that an attacker might be able to use for a replay attack. These browser cookies often have information that's specific to you. It may have personalization details or session management information, and it usually is something that's very unique to your sessions that you're using in the browser. Not only is there personal or private information that might be in these cookies can often contain session IDs as well. If somebody was to gain access to an active session ID, they could pose as you when communicating with another service. The key to a session hijack or sidejack is for the attacker to somehow gain access to the session ID. When the client first logs into the server, they are assigned a session ID, and from that point going forward, the victim is including that session ID when communicating with the service. This means that the user doesn't have to constantly keep logging in with their username and password every time they communicate back to that web server. Instead, they'll simply send the session ID, and that will confirm that the user that's communicating to the web server has already been authenticated. If that attacker gains access to that session ID, they can use that information to pose as the victim and communicate directly to that service without requiring a username or password. This is why it's important to use an encrypted protocol such as SSL or TLS when communicating across the network, which means that the attackers would have no way to gather that session ID off of the network flows. For this session ID attack to work, the attacker needs to first get the session information. They might gather that directly from the network using Wireshark or Kismet to gather it from the wired or the wireless networks. If the server has a cross-site scripting vulnerability, the attacker could use the server to have session ID sent directly to the attacker instead of gathering them from the network. Once the attacker has the session ID information, they need to modify the headers that are being sent to the server, and they might use a third-party utility to be able to do that in real time. The attacker could also modify their browser cookies to make them look identical to those that would come from the victim's computer. One way to prevent these types of replay and session attacks is to make sure that all of the communication between both sides is always encrypted. They can't capture session IDs if it happens to be in this encrypted traffic flow. Turning on encryption on a web server adds some additional overhead, but it is going to protect all of the data that's being sent back and forth. There are some browser extensions you can get that will force communication to be HTTPS or TLS, but many sites these days will only operate as an HTTPS or encrypted channel. So if you were to go to ProfessorMesser.com, you will always be connected over HTTPS. If you're communicating to a service that doesn't support HTTPS or it's using a different type of communication mechanism, then you may want to use something like an encrypted tunnel to at least have part of the communication flow be in this encrypted channel. That way, if anybody does gather that information on that encrypted flow, they would not be able to use any of the information inside of that network traffic. In this video, we're going to talk a lot about cross-site requests. This is something that you'll normally see when communicating with a website. For example, you might visit my website at professormesser.com. When you visit the site, there's going to be text that's loaded directly from my particular web server. The browser is also going to load videos if there happens to be one on the page. That video is not coming from the professormesser.com server, that's coming from the YouTube servers. It might also involve loading some information that's from Instagram. So all of those pictures and images that you're seeing are coming from the Instagram servers. It's the HTML that's in your browser that determines where your browser is going to go to gather the information that's required to make up that page. That is a completely normal and expected process, and it works that way no matter whose website you happen to be visiting. What's interesting about a lot of the requests that are made from the browser when you visit my website is when you're gathering this information from YouTube and from Instagram, you're not having to log in to get that information. That's information that is simply provided to your browser without any type of login credentials. It's this ability to use this trust that's in your browser to be able to gather information from a third-party site, very often without the victim even knowing that it's happening. When you visit a website, there's usually a combination of code that's running. Some of the code is running in a browser that's on the client, and some of the code is running on the web server itself. On the client side, you've got information that's rendering in the browser to show graphics and text, and it's usually something presented as HTML or JavaScript to the browser itself. There's also code that's executing on the web server. That's often HTML and PHP, and this is used to perform back-end processes. For example, you might ask your bank to transfer data, and all that transfer is occurring on the server side. There are also server-side components used for doing things like posting videos to YouTube. When you upload the video, there's an entire re-rendering process and posting process that all takes place behind the scenes on the server without your client on your computer being involved at all. Let's first take advantage of the browser that's on a client computer by using a cross-site request forgery. This is sometimes called a one-click attack or session writing. You might see it abbreviated as XSRF or CSRF. We often refer to this as a CSRF. With this attack, we're taking advantage of the inherent trust that a site has for your browser. You might have already logged into Facebook, for example, so every time you visit facebook.com, it shows as your credentials whenever you're visiting that page. This potentially means that an attacker could get your computer to create requests on their behalf using your credentials, and that's why this is a cross-site request forgery and not an actual cross-site request that's done normally. These types of forgeries obviously should not be happening, so the application developers of the web server need to make sure that they're putting anti-forgery techniques into the code of the service. Usually there's something like a cryptographic token that's used so that someone would not be able to use a forgery to obtain information from that server. Here's an example of a cross-site request forgery that takes advantage of a client's browser. We'll start with the attacker that's going to communicate with a visitor to a bank site's web server. The bank site web server is down here. The attacker is going to create a request that takes advantage of this bank site's visitor's browser and is going to send them that request in some way. Maybe this request is a hyperlink inside of an email, and the attacker wants the client to click on that hyperlink to perform the forgery. The attacker is hoping when the user clicks on this link that they will already be logged in to the bank site server. When they click that link, it sends the request, sometimes without the user even realizing it, to the bank's web server. And because this user is logged in properly, this request is performed as if it's coming directly from the bank site's visitor. If this request is a funds transfer, then the bank web server transfers the funds to the attacker, pulls it out of the bank site's visitor's account, and the request forgery is complete. Another type of forgery gets rid of the client completely. We don't have to worry about trusting that a browser is logged in. We'll instead perform the forgery directly on the server side. This is a server-side request forgery, or SSRF. This requires that the attacker find a web application that is susceptible to this particular kind of attack. And if we send specially crafted packets to the web server, we might be able to have the web server do some work for us on its behalf. This type of attack needs a vulnerable application running on a web server. The attacker will send a request to the web server, and the web server will then perform those requests on behalf of the attacker. This allows the attacker to access services that normally would be inaccessible. They might be on the inside of a private network that only the web server might have access to. But because they're using this server-side request forgery, they can now gain access to those services that normally would be unavailable. This is a type of attack that occurs because the web application is vulnerable. The developers have to make sure that any of the requests that are input are not going to be used by the server to perform additional functions. The server should always evaluate the input to the server and evaluate the output to make sure that none of that information is unexpected. These are relatively uncommon types of vulnerabilities, but when one is found, it's very important to close it before someone's able to take advantage of that forgery. Here's a visual breakdown of the server-side request forgery. We'll start with an attacker who's communicating to a web server. They will send a request that is going to require that web server perform some other function in the background. For example, they may be sending a request to the web server that has the web server query information on a file storage device. That file storage device sends a file or some type of response to the web server, and the web server responds back to the attacker with the information that was requested. That effectively means the attacker has access now to the file storage, even though there is no direct access from the outside. They're having the web server perform that access by using this forgery vulnerability. Here's an example of a server-side request forgery that occurred in 2019. This was one where an attacker was able to execute commands on the Capital One Bank website. This is an attack type that's normally prevented if you're using a web application firewall, or a WAF. In this particular case, they believe that the WAF itself was misconfigured, and the attacker was able to query that WAF and gather information directly from that service. We believe that by using this SSRF attack, the attacker was able to get security credentials of the WAF, and by using those security credentials, was able to access a bucket on Amazon's Simple Storage Service, or S3. This is a file system that exists in the Amazon cloud. Those credentials were able to access those S3 buckets, and inside of those buckets on the Capital One Amazon account were credit card applications that range